I'm here to talk a little bit about simplifying task sequences for scalability. Um, I'm going to try to blow through this kind of quick, and then we can maybe play around in the console. But so, who is this dude? My name is Matt Zaske. I serve as a developer and I'm the fleet administrator for UMN Morris, which is one of the 5 system campuses of the University of Minnesota system. Um, I also sometimes call it the South Dakota campus because it's on the west side of the state. But I periodically write some stuff on a website. I'm on the Bird app. I do some GitHub things, the Discord, Blue Sky, etc. So some contact info. But jumping in, task sequences. Everybody's familiar with them. Some people don't like them. Some people have moved away to newer, modern things. But what do you use task sequences for? Most people end up using them for operating system deployment or in-place upgrades. It's fine. That's a great use case. That's what 90% of ours are for. I also do fun things like manage firmware and drivers with mine. If we have a weird step that needs to be dealt with, or a weird subset, and you have this weird driver that needs to be installed, task sequence can do that for you, right? Weird app deployments. Who here does a weird app deployment? Yeah, that has weird steps or anything else weird, because I like to say the word weird in this slide a whole lot. And when you have a unique app deployment that you can't just do as a regular deployment, a task sequence will give you some steps. You can control that. And that's kind of the point here, right? Is anything and everything can really be done in a task sequence if you want it to. They're especially useful if you have to control reboots. That's why I like firmware updates for certain things like docks. We had a situation where we had an emergency and needed to update dock firmware for all these classrooms in strange locations. And we were able to do it with a task sequence in a controlled way that we wouldn't have been able, we couldn't just deploy an application. It wouldn't have worked because too many conditions applied for that firmware update to be able to go. So those are the sort of things you use task sequences for, right? But in the context of simplifying and scaling your task sequences, I have a few guiding principles that I like to follow. Chief of which is I want to improve the readability and skimmability of my task sequences, because I'm in higher ed, and so every summer, in fact, my team is doing it right now while I'm here, but every summer we have a wipe and load of most of our multi-user spaces, labs, classrooms, etc. It's an easy way to just reset stuff to a default. The problem is that means there's a once a year major refresh of all the stuff in the task sequence that does that. So past me might have thought something was super cool at the time, and it was, but current me is looking at it going, I don't understand what I was doing here. And so being able to jump into a task sequence or anything you haven't looked at for 9 months or longer and figuring out what you're doing and how you're doing it is kind of important, right? I don't want to sit there and go, why did I call this step this name, or where did I hide this particular thing? But I also like to automate the menial or the high failure rate actions. So back in the day when we first started using task sequences in this process, we had to manually type in computer names. It seemed like an okay idea, except I have these meat hooks, and 80% of the time I would fat finger something, and then you hit enter and you'd have to start the whole thing over again because there was no way to back out of that change. So we have a naming scheme. You should have a naming scheme too. I wrote a script, automates that naming scheme, and unless it's a one-off model, that process just does it automatically for us. So automate that kind of stuff. Ultimately, in my role as the fleet administrator for a couple thousand machines on our small little campus, I want the deliverability to be consistent. Right? I want the machine that's built 2 weeks before to be the same machine, as it were, that goes out next week. And how do you do that? Now, I have a tech, and I love the man. He's not watching this, so I can say this. I love the guy, but he likes to tinker. And I can never figure out why he likes to tinker stuff he shouldn't really be tinkering, right? Just because he can doesn't mean he should. And then if something goes sideways, I can't replicate that. I don't know what buttons he tweaked or however, whatever he did. So I really want to maximize that consistency and also minimize that drift at the time of delivery. If I do that, what I've seen over time in our environments is that we don't even bother in many cases to try to fix a machine. It's oh, there's something wrong with that. That's not trivial. Wipe and load. Just because in 2-3 hours on a big lab space, that machine will be back to the way it was when we first delivered it. And ultimately, a guiding principle for me, because I'm kind of lazy and I don't like to deal with it, is I want to reduce the support questions that I get from the techs. I don't want them to ask me, which task sequence options do I run? Which thing do I do? Because that is, well, after the 7th time you've answered that same question for the same person, that gets kind of old. And so if you can simplify things in a way that makes it so you don't have to do that, then that's a win for everybody. So with those sort of guiding principles out of the way, it helps you consolidate stuff, because I forgot about that bullet. So simplify, standardize, and automate. A former director of mine, this was his catchphrase. His big thing was all about, we're going to simplify, standardize, and automate. Well, what does that mean? And for me, in this context of task sequences, it's about identifying and reducing the duplication and the complexity. So is anybody here still using task sequences? Yeah? Okay. How many do you have? More than one? Yeah, right?
5.
Okay, 5. Yeah, sure. So not a lot, but enough where there's got to be duplication between those. And back several years ago now, in our environment, I had one for our high affinity, our employee machines, that kind of stuff. And then I had another one that was often 1 to 2 to 3 that were for all these unique lab situations. But if you step back and look at it, 80-90% is the same. The logic and the stuff behind it. What's the key differentiator? The app stack. That's really the difference. So what I was able to do in my own task sequence journey here was identify all that duplication and in some cases add a little complexity, but in the interest of reducing the complexity and coming back to that guiding principle I mentioned about being able to skim. So then even me, I didn't have to go into the console and say, okay, this was in this lab space. Which task sequence is that is affected? I choose 1 or 2. I do what I need to, and we go from there. The big thing that I already kind of talked about this a little bit, is minimizing the tech and user input and fiddling. Fiddling does not scale well, right? It doesn't, because if you have to touch something, then it's just a bad idea. So one of the things I did, and I'll show a little bit in a bit, is I changed into a model where I created dialogues for folks. I created curated options for them to choose from. And it's basically a front end, right? It's a combination of things that makes a front end. But what that did was it meant that the person that I mentioned before, who was all like, I'm gonna go in and look at all the options, didn't have to go in and look at all those options anymore, because I gave him the options that applied for him. And when he started getting into it and wrapped his head around how that plays out, it helped us a lot, because I noticed fewer failures in the end, in monitoring, and we had fewer questions. He had fewer questions getting thrown back as to why didn't this work? Well, you chose the wrong option because you overrode something. That's on you, dude. Those sort of deals. But automate menial steps. So I mentioned the device name thing. That's just a PowerShell script that really we have in, and I wrote a blog post about it a number of years ago, and I've got that source in GitHub. Is we have a naming scheme, and because we're part of a system, our campus has a 3-digit or a 3-letter designator. So ours is UMM. And then we take the 4-digit model code. We're primarily Dell. So we take the model number and then a service tag, and it's all one thing. There's pros and cons to why to using that sort of a naming scheme, but we have one and it's unique for everybody. And more important to us is it's unique across our system because we share one AD infrastructure. So I don't have my own little domain. We can't do any of that. But creating that device name took out all of those reboots and restarts that we didn't need to do. Similarly, bind location falls into that because we're part of a different a piece in the OU structure. Having a predetermined default bind or customizing where those objects wind up in the directory comes in. Use case dialogues, that's the same sort of thing. Where is this device going? What's it do? And then I also do some log collection, and it's pretty basic. It just grabs the SMSTS logs, drops them on a network share, and then if there's a problem down the road, somebody can ask me about it, and I can go look for the logs instead of try to walk somebody through how to collect those logs. Now, it's only SMSTS sort of stuff, but if I know what I'm looking for, then that can drive me to the other logs that I might need, right? All right. But ultimately, when you step through a bunch of these things, which might seem trivial, and I thought too at times, it's kind of, why am I doing this? Well, when you step through those, what you'll discover is you'll have these reusable or Lego-like extensible modules that you can do. And then we move into how to do stuff with it. And that's where the variables come in. And I call it the magic sauce, because variables really are the way that you can make your task sequences scale to do really neat things without a lot of it takes dev effort, right? But once you're rolling with it, it's great. There's all kinds of built-in variables. If you don't know, go look at the variable list from Microsoft. I did a similar presentation to this at MMS MOA with Carrie Block, and we were doing a demo, and I'll show it in a bit. But in the demo, Gary looked at, he's like, "Why are you doing that that way?" And I said, "Well, I was using a WMI query to determine what the make was." And I said, "Well, it's mostly for history reasons." And he says, "Well, you do realize there's a built-in variable for that." And I was like, "Oh, well, today I learned there's a built-in variable for make that I was overcomplicating because of history. So I never really reevaluated what I was doing." But the list of variables is super neat. I was helping somebody else at a different institution with a problem, and I said, I've never done that, but I see there's a variable there. And so you might be able to create your own little path in your task sequences based on using that variable. And you can always create your own. I mean, there's nothing, your heart's desire, man. You can do whatever you want with variables. And there's lots of different ways to apply and create them. I use a combination of all the things. I have collection variables. So I mentioned we rebuild a lot of machines in place. So we have some conditional apps that go only to certain rooms and certain use cases. Those devices, through other determination methods, wind up in collections in CM that then I have a collection variable for that application. PowerShell, TSN, right? Dot value, and you set a task sequence variable in PowerShell. I'll show it in the console in a bit. And then dedicated steps, right? Set task sequence variable is a step in the task sequence that you can set. The set dynamic variables, you can set many of them in one shot. And when you have your variables set up or change them or however you're going to do it, then you can really do the cool stuff. That's when you can combine things with the task sequence step conditions. And then you build all of the cool things. I think we'll jump over to the console real quick. My mouse wakes up. So if we go in here, this is my soon to need to be rebuilt or rehydrated lab environment. But if I bring up this old task sequence demo that I used to fiddle with, there isn't much to it, right? It's a pretty stock task sequence. It's got some things. In here, though, I've got a pre-flight, and let's look for some variables. Let's do, oh, here we go. Set OSDOU location, high affinity. So in here, there's a task, or there's a PowerShell script. I have this do a web service lookup to see where the old object was. It does some other logic, but at the end, the important part here, I think you can probably see it. TS-environment.value, well, TS-environment.value, OSDOU location is that LDAP path for where that needs to be. So I just set that variable at the end of my little PowerShell script. Great, works. That variable will now exist elsewhere. In my pre-flight task sequence, though, so I have a child task sequence here for pre-flight. If I come over here, let's look. Oh, here we go. This is the default. So this is a set task sequence variable step that sets that OSDOU location that I just noticed in PowerShell to the default LDAP path in my DevTel. So this step happens first with a hard set variable, and then I'm actually modifying that variable later on with PowerShell. Some other ones here, let's see what we got. Oh, collections. Let's jump over to a collection variable. So if I go over to a collection, let's look for Solstice. That's one. We use Mersive Solstice as our projection display stuff in our classroom. So in the collection variables tab, here you can create a variable. So I have an app Solstice variable, and I set that to true. So I got 3 ways, 3 variables, choose your own path, right? But if I come back to, let's see, the fleet, the apps. In a child task sequence, I've got this Solstice step. And under the options, it is if that task sequence variable app Solstice equals true. It will skip that if we don't. Now, you probably used this sort of thing in the past, right? But when you combine these things together and really re-architect, in a sense, what you're doing, you can start layering all these bits together and really build something that that scales out in ways you might not have had in the past. So if I jump back over in the console here to which one is it? It's in this one. No, not that one. Pop-up variables. This is that make thing I mentioned. So if you use the set dynamic variables step, what is happening in this site is a little bit unrelated. But if you set dynamic variables, a bunch of variables are automatically populated in a task sequence, such as this underscore SMSTS make and SMSTS model. So those variables just come along because you did a step somewhere else. That's kind of neat. And that was really, when I discovered this recently, a little bit mind-blowing. Like, oh, I can go get rid of all of that gnarly long.
Yeah. In the task sequence step, the WMI query. Wow.
Yep, okay. That WMI query goes away now. So if I look at one for that, where is the Dell one? Here, Dell BIOS firmware updates. Here it is. That's what I used to be using. The WMI query, select from the Win32 computer system, right? Manufacturer like Dell. I swapped that out. These two things do the same thing in essence. Mm-hmm. Right? As long as that SMSTS make is set. So one of the reasons I bring this up is there's always multiple ways to do the same thing. So just because I have the WMI queries set up that way, it doesn't mean I'll probably deprecate them and take it as an opportunity to reevaluate what I'm doing, but there we are. So that kind of makes sense in the variable angle, yeah?
Then how did you so you just set that in it, at what point in the task sequence is it setting that task?
The SMSTS make variable. So it gets set. The SMSTS make and model and a couple of the other built-in ones happen on if I choose the right task sequence. They will be populated when the set dynamic variables step is run. So in order to make it work, and I did this quite literally a week and a half ago, so I haven't had the chance to really fiddle with it myself much. All I did was I just told it to set some random variable to nothing. I needed the step to run. When the step runs, no matter what the step does, it populates those a handful of read-only variables. And I don't know that I have a link in the slide deck for it, but it's out. It's published on Microsoft, and there's you can see the list of those that show up. And it's make, model, and I forget others. All right. So if we jump back to the slide deck, I already talked a little bit about this child task sequence thing. But once you have compartmentalized a bunch of this stuff, now you can start talking about the modules, the chunking out, the stuff. And when you combine that, or you have child task sequences that do their thing, you also have variables and variable-driven groups that you can use in a task sequence to also chunk out stuff. What I like about combining the two, because why not both, is if you have child task sequences, you can reuse that logic in many different places. If you have variable-driven groups, you can conditionally do stuff within that. If you start mixing and matching it, you really can create this pretty powerful create your own journey, right? You can say, I'm doing this multi-user weird lab location. I'm gonna go on a different path early on in my task sequence for whatever reason. But at the end, some of the child task sequences that I'm using to lay down an OS or do the other, do some of these components, I'm going to reuse those elsewhere. There's sort of pros and cons, right? Like everybody's journey is going to be a little different on how and where they want to choose to do that duplication. And somebody asked me this question a while back of, how far do you go? Where do you stop? Well, you could create a child task sequence or a group for all these different things. But again, then if you have 40 child task sequences, you have to try to reconcile that in your head in the console in the moment and find that one. So it's kind of your mileage may vary. Figure out what you're comfortable with, what makes sense to you, what can you come back and read about and skim about in 6 months from now. And so that's that part. And I think I can jump over. Oh, didn't let the animation run. So in this particular case, like here's a bunch of child task sequences. I stole this from Gary.
Yeah, looks like Gary stuff.
Yep. So if you have that, this one is mine though. This is that same business that I was showing earlier. I've got all these little conditional groups within a child task sequence. And you really build on all this unique logic. So that point, we start talking about user input. So I mentioned this too about minimizing the touch points for my user or for my techs, and specifically trying to control the techs a little bit with pre-configured options. And by doing that, it not only, it saves your decision fatigue is a thing. And if you're in that moment, you can sort of which option, and I have done this in labs before too, where I've got 5 of them running in a row, and I just take my rolly chair and I go enter, 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 and then it's like a typewriter style. And it's really easy to start forgetting which step you were on. I also like to have a few sanity checks in place. Excuse me. One of those is, and I showed that business with it goes and looks at the web service, tells me what OU that object used to be in, and what object or what OU or use case it might wind up as. If those are in wildly different places, like in my case, we sometimes take high affinity devices that are out of service from their first life, and we put them into a multi-user space. That's a legit move into a very different life. When that happens, though, if we weren't proactive in moving the object or deleting the existing object, that sanity check says, hold up, are you sure? It's a non-breaking change. It really is just an alert to the tech to say, if you're serious about this, know that object's going to have to be moved, because it's no longer going to inherit some of the group policy that it needs in its new life, all those other sort of things. Um, and it's just a way to help save us from ourselves. All right. But then there's also overriding options, because trust me, I know what I'm doing. What could possibly go wrong? But again, in the overriding is, if you're overriding the options, I want you to override options that are vetted, that are allowed. Because if you don't, then I can't replicate it, right? Like we haven't tested for that, or we don't have a path forward. So how do you do that? Well, you can create custom win forms, dialogues. This is the dialogue that I hate. I loathe this dialogue. This is about the 17th iteration of it. I haven't changed it for a few years. I hate this dialogue because I don't like the text. This text drives me nuts. What is this? It's an employee. It's a lab, but it's this other type of lab. Years and years, I continually got questions like, well, which one should I use? Well, is it a computer lab? Is it a generic computer lab? Use the generic computer lab. Oh, okay. I ended up putting some of the room numbers in there, and it solved the problem. So again, back to I don't want to take the questions. I hate this dialogue, but this dialogue and the text that's written makes sense for my text, so they don't ask me. So I guess it's just one of those I'm going to let pass, right? And I just whipped that together in a WinForms application and export it out, and off we go. And then there's a little bit of logic that takes the output, the selection, and then what it does on clicking OK is it sets a task sequence variable that says, what's my install type? And from there, then the choose your path stuff happens. But there's also built-in dialog boxes like TS-COM object, the generic sort of stuff like, do you want to launch the debugger, or any of those sort of yes, no, simple sort of things. There's front ends though. I've considered doing front ends in the past. There are a number of different options. When I started looking at doing a front end, or implementing a front end rather, I quickly learned that our use cases, while diverse, were not really justifying a full-on front end, because what I didn't like about it is it gave a little bit too many options to the text that I didn't want to have to try to claw back. It added too much complexity, is really the takeaway. So to that end, finishing touches. So I use TS background. I love TS background. It's fairly lightweight. It looks pretty. And it does everything that I need it to do for our environment. So in this particular case, that's just a little screenshot of it that was building in my lab environment. I have this picture that our wonderful graphic designer took a number of years ago of our Welcome Center building at night or in the evening. And so it looks familiar. And it tells me a few things, right? It tells me what the machine name is, what the build type is, where the OU is the IP address, and what step we're on. It looks so much prettier than the generic task sequence step. I use TS background, as I mentioned, but there's a lot of different options. There's BG info. Some people love that. I've never really gotten it to do what I want it to do, so I've kind of moved away from it. TS progress UI inputs, if you want to do that. Splash screens. When they were at Big Bank, those folks did some sort of a splash screen on their in-place upgrades that was, I forget exactly how they did it, but it was a blank screen with words on it that says, stuff's happening. Just leave it alone.
Walk through the steps.
Yeah. And but the other part too is create friendly names or friendly step names. If your techs are using it, make sure they understand what it is. Or if you've got an in-place upgrade or something that's exposed to an end user, make it make sense for them. It's not as important for OSD cases, but again, do what makes sense for you. And then, just because it's a little bit bigger, this was from a production VM, a production test VM in our VMware environment that I was playing around with in April when I was first testing this year's iteration. But yeah, it looks nice. right? Like, and then the little circle in the middle spins around so it doesn't look like it's frozen up and that kind of stuff. What I like about TS Background though is it provides a lot of options to me that I wouldn't have normally without knowing how to get in and launch like CM Trace and that kind of stuff. So you can hit F8, enter a password, and then you get this magic, which is I can launch command prompt, I can do CM Trace, I can jump right into SMSTS log, but I can also look at all of these variables in real time. So I can reload, down here in the bottom, I can hit the reload button when that's up, and I can watch the variables change as you go along. So it's not quite a debugger, right? But if I know something's, if I have a tech that says, I think something isn't working right, I can have them do that. Give me that information real time. So, talked about getting to this point, but what happens when stuff goes wrong? Because it's inevitable that things will go wrong. There are a million different types of ways to troubleshoot and handle problems. Common one is TS Debugger. I honestly don't use TS Debugger as much as I should at this point, because a lot of times in my own, I've gotten to a point now over many years of constant iteration and change of this, where when I'm doing a change, I have a separate stripped down task sequence that usually is just to test those pieces. So I can kind of fail quickly. I don't necessarily have to run the debugger. I do run the debugger once in a while, but not as sort of standard practice. And I mentioned that shipping logs business. I had a machine froze up on us just, I think, on Tuesday. And my tech came back to me and said, hey, this is still looking weird. And I said, well, I'll look at the log. So I jumped over to the file share where all those logs get dropped, and I didn't see a folder for that device. I said, well, that tells me that task sequence didn't finish, so there was a problem. So I said, just wipe and load, start afresh. Let's cut the loss and just move on. And he did, and turns out it failed a second time. So we just pulled the device and swapped it out with something different, because it's not worth trying to, in that case, not worth trying to fix it. But you can also do stuff in place like registry tattooing. You can write reg key values and do all that kind of jazz. That's your thing. One thing that I really adopted that my techs like, and I actually like for me, is I create custom notifications. So we use Slack in our environment, and I have a webhook for Slack, a very specific Slack channel. Well, there's a couple of them. And what happens is I get this little notification every time. Well, I shouldn't say every time. I get this notification at some point after every task sequence build completes. What's happening is one of the wrap-up steps during that whole business of collecting logs, I have a web server that sits out there that accepts post input. That's a whole nother chat, but my task sequence has a PowerShell step that collects a few variables. What's the firmware rev? What's the MAC address? How was it built? A few of those other things. And it sends JSON post data to this web server. The web server does, from the web server, it's written to file. And then I have an automation job that does some inventory asset management things downstream. But since I had the data there, I had it create this notification for me. So that way, what I do in this case, I have the channel muted most of the time, but once a day, once every other day, I usually go in there, especially during the busy time, and I do the little check mark on it's a trust but verify. Did that object actually get moved where it needed to? In most cases, I know it doesn't need to be moved, so it's a moot point. Did the object get moved? Did the right user get associated in our asset management? So the asset management is correct, but we also have to assign to a user. I don't have that information in the task sequence. So our techs usually during that deployment will go jump into the asset management and do the user assignment for high affinity devices. I can double check that because I can do that in the moment or much closer to the time of the source of the change, which then when I start reconciling inventory as I plan for our next year's replacements and stuff, I have less work to do in 6 months because I know when those devices were provisioned that we had about as good a record as possible. And I get that in a very passive way through stuff like this. To that end, I also hijack legal text values. So on a brand new build, on a bare metal, it winds up in a generic new computers OU. And so I just steal the Control-Alt-Delete text, as it were, for a time. And really, that's more for my other techs to say, here's a device that got built out. They walked away, came back in a day or the next morning, and we need to make sure that object gets to where it needs to be, which is a manual step for us for other reasons. But because we don't want that device to go out to a user like that, because it's still not done. So that's how I handle some of that. Basic troubleshooting, disable problem steps, pause. This is TS debugger stuff. I actually did use it. I was having a really strange issue last 2 weeks ago, trying to cut 30 seconds off of our task sequence time. And I'll tell about that in a minute. But I was having a really strange issue, and I finally was like, I'm just going to launch the debugger. It's easier because then I can step around it. Descriptions. So when you build out your collection of task sequence modules, collection, all the stuff, use the description field. Tag a version sometimes. Do what makes sense for you is really my takeaway. But sometimes I just use the description to say this was the last modified iteration, not date. Mine goes in cycles, right? So this is the summer 2024 cycle complete, whatever, however you want to do it. But really, the takeaway is start small and add on slowly. So start working, don't try to solve all of the variables at one point. Just start troubleshooting one piece at a time. Test and test and test. And then keep track of those changes. In a while, I'll talk a little bit about Git. In theory, you can store a task sequence in Git. You could use version control like that if you wanted to. But you don't have to. I mean, it can be as simple as exporting some stuff and saving it however you want. Has anybody ever gone down the road and made major changes and thought it was great and then couldn't remember what they changed because they overrode their original? Yeah, that happens, right?
When you have multiple people working on the same task sequence.
Multiple people yes, exactly. So that kind of stuff. And of course, device model testing, right? Everybody has its own quirks. I still have, to this day, we have a couple of Dell Latitude models that they just have the default audio driver doesn't behave. We have one model that has a wonky trackpad driver. We actually, in a weird way, it seems to apply the same driver after the fact as what happens in the task sequence, but it just doesn't behave. I don't know why. But yeah, use Hyper-V, VMware, whatever, do a lab, set that stuff up. It will really help you. And iteration is kind of my key here. I was sharing this story with, I think it was Haley last night. Yeah. And solving all the problems at once is just going to drive you up the wall. I've been working on our production task sequence improvement for over a decade now. And it took a long time to get to where we are. And when you start going down the road of perfect is the enemy of good, then you're never going to get anywhere. You get that decision fatigue and it's never going to get released. And yeah, don't do that. I oversee our device management team, which is a very small group of people. It's me and the techs, right? And one of the things I do is usually in, April-ish, when I'm thinking about the next big iteration, is I meet with them and I ask them 4 or 5 times during the course of a 1-hour meeting, tell me what drives you nuts about the process. Because the first time you ask, they'll be like, oh, it's fine. And the second time you ask, they'll be like, well, there was this thing. And I tell them, I might not be able to help. There are some things that are out of my control. But this is where that 30 seconds shaving off time thing comes in. This year, one of the techs was like, I'd really like it if we could do all of those dialogues a little bit earlier. Now, they all happen within the first couple minutes, right? And so I was like, okay, tell me more about what you're looking for. Well, it turns out, for a specific reason, historically, I had a task sequence, or I had a couple of dialogues that popped up after the clean disk and disk partitioning steps. Well, those steps take a long time. Not forever, right? But that takes a little bit extra time. So he was like, I just want to get on to the next thing. It'd be great if I could do that before that step. And I'm like, okay, I'll see what I can do. And I looked, and my real cursory testing is, we're talking about maybe 30 seconds, right? It's not a big change. But I think the important part is, it's a big thing for him. It makes his life a little better, maybe. It speeds up the process. It was also an opportunity for me to clean up atone for some past sins, if you will. I had some problems that bubbled up, and took care of them. But yeah, embrace that consistency when you deviate. And that's back to that choose your own adventure thing, right? If you can choose your own adventure and give your techs enough of that leverage to do what they need to do in the moment, then you can really make some cool stuff. And then track metrics and benchmarks. So my story about this, and brag about that, because this is how you get the buy-in for, I spent a lot of time on this. Why did you spend a lot of time to shave 30 seconds off? Well, okay, that I didn't spend a whole lot of time on. But in 2020, we were coming back for the fall semester, and we had a whole bunch of supply chain issues. And we were getting machines delivered the week that everybody came back. We had to roll out all of this stuff very quickly. And so what I did is, on one day, I came in about 8. I started at 8, and I called it a day at 5. And I didn't take a lunch or do anything. I just powered through all these labs. I built out 145 machines in one day by myself, just walking around all the lab spaces. Now, I never want to do that again. That's one machine about every 3 minutes. Now, those weren't, to use Michael Nystrom's, they weren't done, right? At 5 o'clock, I hit the last dialogue in the thing. But they were done the next morning, and that's what really mattered. But 145 I was able to do because over the course of the previous, 5 years or so that I'd been working on this and making all these iterative changes, I improved that process to the point where I could just literally walk around and do that. I didn't have to babysit or follow up after the fact. I mean, I can see, again, I get all those logs and stuff. I could see from remote, as it were, that it was working. And I hope to never have to do that again. A comfortable is like 50, because then you can do other things and maybe eat. And then, like I mentioned earlier, automate and feed those downstream processes. Status updates, that Slack notification, asset management stuff. If you collect some data out of it, then you can do stuff with that data. What that is going to depend upon what you need. So, yeah, and test. And then test some more, because then you're going to have that weird model that doesn't want to work either. And that's all I had for the slide deck part. Looks like we got some time. Probably we can do some questions and whatnot. And I mean, I can jump into the console if we want to look at stuff again, but it's, to my mind, a lot of this isn't necessarily like earth-shattering stuff, but what I think is important is for folks who are still in the task sequence world. So we're co-managed. We're going to be co-managed for a very long time at this point. And that's mostly political reasons for us. But we'll probably do some autopilot for part of our fleet. But a big part of it is going to likely remain in task sequences for the foreseeable future. So you might as well try to make your life a little easier. Yeah, that's what I got. I'll stop the share, I think, and then I can maybe look at, there's chat or.
So back to the question about backing up the task sequences. What is your process for backing them up? Because I used to do it manually, and some of my cohorts don't do it at all. It'd be nice to, we could automate.
So I'll be honest, I don't really back up much of my stuff at all for when it comes to the task sequences. I need to clarify that a little bit though. What I end up doing is it's usually once a year or whenever I really do a burn it down and start and rehydrate my lab, then I will usually export those task sequences and import them into my lab. So my own backup strategy is mostly by virtue of having a lab space, which isn't really a backup strategy,
Okay.
but I make a lot of
Somebody
copies.
had created a script that turned it into an XML file and I can pull it into Excel.
I think there is. I don't know.
But I don't think we have it, but we don't have it automated. It's strictly.
Yeah. Someone here says, I have a recurring item on my Outlook calendar to remind me to back up the tasks quarterly. Yep. Yep. That's a great.
Okay.
Let's see. Let's scroll through here. Yeah, stupid apps that require a reboot. Yes. Oh yeah. Child task sequences. I didn't mention this earlier. Somebody mentioned child task sequences were super flaky for me when they first came out. Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
They were terrible, and they've been fixed. So if you're still in that environment, give it another shot, because they work in ways that they are supposed to at this point. Yeah, set dynamic variables. You have to set at least one of your own variables. That's that. I created that blank one. And yeah, somebody shared the link from Adam Gross's much well written.
You see, your task sequence has so many steps there. How long does it take for you to image a device? Is it longer? Or are you doing anything to make it shorter the time?
So the task sequence that I have, we have one now for all of our production sites.
Okay.
All of the use cases are covered under one, unless they have multiple disks or there's some other weird one-offs that are separate. But if you choose the high affinity, the regular employee route, they'll be done within an hour.
Okay.
And like deliverable on the desk, ready to go. If, however, in our media lab, which has then the like full-on all apps Adobe Creative Cloud suite, and I think there's Vectorworks. There's a bunch of big apps. That'll take 4.5 hours for that for that to lay down. Yeah, but it really, it all happens through the same process, and so all those steps. This is the one thing that I don't necessarily like. This is me editorializing it. When you look, because that task sequence has all those options in it, it'll say that there's like 450 steps. Well, the reality is if you're on an employee machine, no, it's probably like 80. But it's all those other things that get brought along because it's part of the task sequence, even if it never gets invoked or it all gets skipped because of that. So, error timeouts. Yeah. Error timeouts. I didn't mention that, but yeah, if you set timeout values, then at least it'll fail in a proper time. So let's see. Oh, did you explain why you needed to cut that 30 seconds? So it was, I didn't need to cut it. It was my tech really wanted it to be not so much cutting out the 30 seconds, but he wanted to be able to move on to the next item, or the next machine.
30 seconds can add up if you're doing 20 machines.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. But it wasn't really a demand. It was more of I did it in kind because he's a good dude and I was able to make it work. So, he really wanted to be able to say, I've got a machine running here. I'm going to hit this button and I'm going to move to the next one. But when that disk partitioning and formatting step happens, he'd have to stay there just for that little bit of extra time. And it bugged him. And it comes back to that concept that I mentioned of listening to the text, right? Some of it is I make the buttons, they push the buttons. If I make the buttons easier for them to push, then I have to push fewer of the buttons myself, right? So it's a little bit self-serving. I mean, I do help them and I run around and do stuff too, but so. Let's see, can we run winget to install apps from the task sequence? I don't, in full OS maybe. I've never tried it. I might have to try that at some point.
So in your environment, how do you kick off task sequences? Do you have like Pixie? Do you run with the USB sticks? What do you do?
So we use Pixie booting primarily for kicking them off. And somebody goes around and Pixie boots them. We don't have them wake up. A lot of that comes to, we don't have a lot of need to remotely kick off a task sequence or remotely start one. But then there's other political, possibly geopolitical things. The network guys like to fight with other people, and there's politics. And then because we're part of a system, we have to work within some frameworks, so there are some constraints there. But yeah, Pixie is primarily what we do. I will do some boot media once in a while too. So let's see. Oh yeah, ISO's auto start, and then a VDI team can build out. Yep. The server guys won't let us use Pixie in the data center. Yep. I have a weird problem right now with mine where Pixie in our VMware infrastructure works about 40% of the time lately. And I think it was a VMware update. I don't know. It works fine otherwise. Any other questions? I don't need to keep talking. So, jumbo packets. Okay, I'll do that. Thank you. Well, thanks for listening.
All right. Thank you.
you.
Appreciate it.